Strangest looking beast you ever saw. It was a 1947 Studebaker. It had huge rear wheels with big, kind of like mud grip tires with that big aggressive tread. Make a lot of noise when they went down the highway. This car also had a cracked manifold that whispered and made strange noises, particularly when the motor was traveling down the road. But we drove that thing to Fort Lee, Virginia, where we did this summer camp thing. The car looked like it was perpetually going downhill because of the big tires. We'd go through those little towns in southeast Ohio and West Virginia before the Eisenhower interstates. And this thing would be making all these strange noises, and the locals would whip around and wonder what that was. But it got us to Fort Lee. Fort Lee is not too far from Richmond. It's kind of between Petersburg over here on one side and a little village on the other side called Hopewell. Hopewell was a grubby little place in those days. And Jim was fond of saying that he believed that there was more Peter in Petersburg than there was hope in Hopewell. That strange beast got us back home, and somehow Dr. Henry disposed of it, and we never saw it again. Thinking back in the 50s when all this nonsense was taking place, you remember when George Bush the Elder talked about a kinder, gentler society? Well, the 50s were a kinder, gentler society, and today the big scourge of the mind-bending drugs had not settled over the society so much, and the big nasty thing of the day was alcohol. The university had a number of rules about alcohol in those days, prohibited being in the fraternities and sororities, the rooming houses, anywhere on the university properties. And our fraternity had a rule to do prohibiting alcohol, which we abided by most of the time, more or less, as much as we could. Jim came up with the idea that a little nip of something would enhance our studying. At this particular time, we were rooming together, and he thought that there ought to be some way for us to have a little something, just a slight buzz, to make the process go better. And someone had told us that you could create hard cider and get it to a point where it created a bit of a buzz. And all you had to do was dump some raisins or some source of sugar and some apple juice, and lo and behold, you would eventually have hard cider. So that sounded like the answer to our little buzz plan. So we bought a glass jug of cider, and we dumped a bunch of raisins in there, and we corked it up and set it over in the corner of the closet. Let nature do its thing and provide us with a little something. Nobody bothered to tell us that the fermentation processes produces gas and pressure. It really needs a vent. It didn't have a vent. And one night, the lid blew off that thing and the neck of the bottle split. And the glass went all over the closet. Everything that was down low got hosed with this sticky mess. Shoes were just saturated. It did not work out well. And that was the last venture into moonshine. There were some very serious comments this morning by my two predecessors. Jim did some marvelous work. I don't pretend to understand any of it. But my emphasis today, my intent was to provide a little lighter side of Jim. A fun guy that I enjoyed being with, I really did. I know that he was well thought of in academia and in his professional life. Obviously did a fine job of parenting along with Betty Sell. Raised 3 fine children. There were times probably in your teenage years when you thought the old man had really gone over the edge. But hey, it worked out all right. I mean, look at him today. Huh? I'm pleased to have known Jim. I really enjoyed him. I feel privileged to have known him. And I think that I miss him today, probably always will. I think in balance, I can say that his was a life well lived. I really believe that. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. At this time, you all are invited to share your own recollections and thoughts on this occasion. We set up a microphone for this purpose in the center aisle. It's probably easiest and fairest to folks who'd like to say something, just queue up at the microphone. There's been some chairs provided there if you wanted to take a seat and while you're waiting for your turn. If anybody has a disability and have trouble getting to the microphone, we have a long cord and we can pass it to you. Since we don't all know one another, you might want to begin by introducing yourself. I'll also ask that you try to keep your comments relatively brief. We want everyone who'd like to say something to have his or her turn. And in any case, we need to wrap up by around 6 o'clock when dinner will be served upstairs. You all probably watched the Academy Awards show, and when an award winner's thank you speech runs too long, the director signals the orchestra to start playing some music. And I'm going to take on the director's role this afternoon. So if you hear music starting to well up in the background, that's my gentle way of asking you to start wrapping it up. A number of people who couldn't be here today have also sent messages to Betty, and as time permits, we'll try to read some of those also to one another. If people want to make their way to the mic, that's fine. To get things started, I've got a note from Harry Triandis that he wanted us to read. Harry couldn't be here today. One second. Go ahead, Scott, and I'll find it.
I'm Scott Tyndale. I was one of Jim's students from the late 70s till the early 80s. And trying to figure out what I was going to say today was very hard, because Jim and Betty played a major role in so many different aspects of my life. But so I decided to go back to one of the earliest memories that sort of struck me. One of the things that I think exemplifies how Jim sort of thought about being a mentor. And at the end of my first semester in graduate school, you're very tired, you work really, really hard, you're not sure that you're really having much of an impact on anything. And I had a lot of help from the members of the crack staff and Jim, so right before I went home for Christmas, I went out and with my limited budget for graduate school, I went out and bought a airplane-sized bottle of alcohol for each of the various members of the crack staff. And for Jim, I bought a bottle of Crown Royal. It was the king, so they decided I should give him the crown. And so I went home and I came back, and Jim didn't really mention this. He didn't say anything about it or anything. So things went on, and I finally did finish. And Jim and Betty invited me out to dinner to celebrate my finishing. And just before I stopped off at their house, and just before we went out, Jim comes out with this little bottle of Crown Royal and 2 glasses. He goes, I've been saving this ever since you gave it to me. It's a very nice gesture, and I decided that I would use it for a toast when it's finished. And I'm going right at the point where I wasn't even sure I was going to come back. He was already planning a toast for me finished. So it's that kind of confidence and faith in the students that I think is part of what made him such a special person to work with.
I'm Craig Parks. I was also a former student of Jim's. I started in 86 and I finished up in 91. And 2 things I think about when I think about Jim. When I started graduate school, there were 2 things that I really, really, really enjoyed a lot: baseball and rock music, the louder the better. And as many of you may know, 2 of the things that Jim really despised were baseball and rock music. I always liked when we had parties at the house, because when I was a student, Steve was at home, and I liked when we had parties at the house because Steve would inevitably DJ, and he would put on the Rolling Stones, for example, and play it loud, which I thought was great. Jim would tolerate for a brief amount of time, and then would indicate to Steve that it was time to turn it down. So, and those were fond memories of mine. With baseball, as many of you know, Jim was quite a tennis player. And I once asked him, well, why don't you like baseball? And he said, because it's boring. Tennis, that's exciting. And I like tennis. But I said, how can that be? Tennis is a lot of standing around, just like baseball, a lot of throwing balls in the air, just like baseball. I don't follow your logic here. And he actually came up with, I kid you not on this, he came up with a model to explain to me why and baseball was not. And I couldn't, I couldn't quarrel with it, and so I conceded that to him. The rock music, however, I've actually figured out a way today to maybe get the last word in on this. And this is a comparison that Jim would not have liked, but I'm going to make it anyway. When Johnny Cash died, Bob Dylan said, Johnny Cash is the Northern Star. You can sail your ship by him. And what Dylan meant was, if you're never sure what to do in life, just look at what Johnny Cash would do, and he'll always get you home. That's the way Jim was for me. Thank you.
I'll read the following note from Harry and Politriandis. Harry writes, Jim Davis, a brilliant colleague with a superb sense of humor. Jim was so much fun to be with. From Illinois to England, from Temecula, California to Corfu, Greece, he has left wonderful memories of good times together. We'll miss him very much. Jim had a broad perspective on social psychology that included culture. He was, above all, a scientist, stressing that so much of contemporary thinking involves self-deception, such as identifying something as real when in fact it was a mere placebo. Our discussions on physics and metaphysics were always satisfying. Jim was an expert on beer, especially German beers. He enjoyed good food and drink, and he kept his cheerful disposition in spite of major medical problems. A long time ago, when we had a pro seminar in the department, after my lecture, a student came over to ask if I liked good food. I said, of course. The student was an amateur cook, and he came to the house and spent a whole day preparing a meal that the Davis and Triandis had that evening. Jim loved that kind of occasion, with good wine, and food, and friends. He always provided sparkling conversation with many anecdotes. Oh, such good times. And Polar writes, Jim Davis had an infinitely witty and clever way with words. Whether describing someone, friend or foe, with the mot juste, or recounting one of his army experiences, he had us breathless with laughter. Jim made the most elegant and clever use of the English language. I loved arguing with Jim. It was never ad hominem. He was far too generous for that. And it could be an exhilarating experience. Of course, he invariably won, whether it was debating about the French or fish. He strongly disliked both. I had some wonderful moments trying to persuade him that fish had been proven good for you. He remained unconvinced, but it was all in good fun and kept us on our toes. The conversation will be much duller without all that, said Paula.
My name's Lou Penner. I hadn't planned on saying anything because actually I was very fortunate. When I knew Jim was seriously ill, I wrote to Betty and told her everything Jim had meant to me. And then, even more importantly, shortly before Jim passed, Jim and I exchanged emails, and I have the last email from Jim, which I have framed, which, maybe tell the end of the story, what Jim said to me is, you're not stupid. Which, for Jim, the two sins you could have is to be dumb and to be boring. And if you fell in that set that you considered you neither dumb or boring, you were blessed. But anyhow, I'm the product of Jim's dark period in Oxford, Ohio. I think, with the exception of his fraternity brother, I may be the person that goes farthest, obviously, except for Betty and his children. But Jim and I first met in 1965 when I was this diffident graduate student, and I was looking around for a master's advisor, and Jim was clearly the brightest person on faculty.